Adrian had always known that life in a small seaside town carried with it a peculiar rhythm. The mornings arrived early, with gulls wheeling overhead and the distant sound of waves breaking against the shore. The afternoons were filled with the scent of saltwater and roasted coffee beans drifting from the family cafe that had stood at the edge of town for decades. The evenings, quiet and subdued, were when the town shrank into itself, the streets emptying until only the hum of the ocean and the creak of wooden shutters remained. For most people, it was an uneventful cycle. For Adrian, it had become the background to a storm quietly building inside his chest. The cafe was more than just a business. It was a stage on which every day played out the delicate balance of family, reputation, and unspoken expectations. Tourists came and went, locals filled their usual tables, and Adrian and Damien worked side by side behind the counter. On the surface, they were simply family, boys who had grown up under the same roof, who had learned to share chores, meals, and secrets. To anyone else, there was nothing remarkable about their closeness. But beneath that facade, there was a subtle shift neither of them could ignore anymore. That it had not begun suddenly. It crept in like a tide, unnoticed at first. Adrian found himself paying attention to details that should have been ordinary, the way Damien's sleeves rolled up when washing glasses, the ease in his laughter when customers made jokes, the way his shoulders filled doorways as if he belonged in every space. These were small things, but they left an imprint on Adrian's mind, echoing long after the day was over. At night, when the cafe had been locked and the world seemed to fold itself into silence, Adrian would lie awake in the small attic room above the shop. The faint scent of roasted beans clung to the walls, mixing with the salt carried in from the sea breeze. It was in those moments, when the town seemed to be holding its breath, that he allowed himself to replay the fragments of the day, a glance across the counter, a brush of hands while passing a plate, a shoulder brushing his as they worked in tight spaces. None of these meant anything on their own, but together they formed a language he could not deny. For weeks, he tried to silence the thought. He told himself it was the isolation of the town, the monotony of the cafe, the claustrophobic closeness of living under one roof. He told himself that anyone might imagine something more in moments like these. But the excuses began to wear thin. The feelings remained, persistent and unrelenting, growing in intensity with every stolen second of closeness. The turning point came on a late evening at the cusp of summer. The cafe had just closed, and the two of them lingered longer than usual, cleaning in silence as the last light of day faded. The smell of coffee grounds mixed with the humid air, heavy with the coming night. When everything was done, they climbed the narrow staircase to the upper floor, where the attic windows opened out toward the restless sea. The horizon was still faintly lit, a thin line of silver against the darkening water. The waves rolled endlessly, carrying secrets no one would ever hear. Adrian stood by the window, his heartbeat unsteady, aware of Damien's presence behind him like a shadow that both comforted and unsettled him. The space between them was charged in a way that could not be explained to anyone else. The silence stretched, thick and unbroken, and in that silence something shifted. There was no sudden confession, no words to break the moment. Instead, there was simply the awareness of closeness, the unmistakable sense that they had crossed into a place where returning would no longer be possible. Adrian could feel the weight of it pressing on his chest, mingling with the salt air until he could hardly tell where the sea ended and his thoughts began. When Damien moved closer, the air seemed to tighten. The sound of the ocean swelled, filling the gaps between their breaths. Adrian did not resist. He let the moment envelop him, even as fear tugged at the edges of his mind. The closeness was overwhelming, terrifying, and yet it felt inevitable, as though all the small fragments of the past months had been leading them here. For a brief instant, it was as if the rest of the world had fallen away. The weight of the town, the gossip of neighbors, the expectations of their parents, none of it seemed to exist. There was only the warmth of another body standing beside him, the sound of waves breaking like a heartbeat, and the quiet certainty that something had begun that could not easily be undone. Later, when Adrian found himself alone in his room, the night pressing heavy against the window, he tried to convince himself it was nothing more than a fleeting weakness. But the truth lingered stubbornly in his chest. The memory of the closeness refused to fade, replaying with vivid detail every time he closed his eyes. He knew, with a clarity that left him breathless, that a line had been crossed, and yet, instead of fear, what he felt most was a dangerous kind of exhilaration. The secret was theirs alone, hidden beneath the ordinary routines of the cafe and the predictable rhythm of town life. No one could see it, not yet. But Adrian understood that secrets carried weight, and this one was heavier than anything he had ever known. As the night wore on, he lay awake listening to the ocean. Each wave that struck the shore seemed to echo his thoughts, relentless and uncontainable. He knew this was only the beginning. What had been ignited between them was not something that could simply fade. It was a flame, fragile yet consuming, flickering dangerously in the dark. And though he told himself he should be afraid, deep down Adrian realized he did not want it to go out. Morning light crept into the attic room with the same indifference it always had, slanting through thin curtains and painting the walls in muted gold. Yet for Adrian, the world did not look the same. The night before lingered in his chest like an aftertaste too sharp to swallow. He felt it in the way his heart skipped when footsteps moved in the hallway, in the way he hesitated before descending the narrow staircase to the cafe below. The air between them had shifted, and though no one else could sense it, the weight of it pressed on him from the moment he opened his eyes. The cafe carried on with its familiar rhythm. Customers shuffled in, voices blended with the clinking of cups, and the hum of the espresso machine filled the air. To anyone looking in, nothing had changed. Adrian moved behind the counter, taking orders, pouring coffee, wiping tables. Damien worked nearby, sleeves rolled up, hair catching the morning light through the windows. They worked in practice synchrony, moving around each other with the same ease as always, but every step, every glance, carried a charge that made the ordinary unbearable. Adrian noticed details more acutely now, as if the world had sharpened overnight. The brush of an elbow as they passed, the warmth of a hand reaching too close, the quick look shared across the counter, all of it carried the memory of the moment by the window. It was dangerous, intoxicating, and impossible to ignore. He wanted to believe that no one could see it, but paranoia crept in. When regulars smiled too knowingly or lingered with small talk, he wondered if their secret was already visible, written on their faces for the whole town to read. As the day wore on, the tension deepened. Every second in the cafe became a delicate act of balance, of suppressing the fire that burned too brightly just beneath the surface. Customers laughed, conversations drifted, and plates clattered against the sink, but for Adrian, time felt stretched thin, pulled tight between normalcy and the memory of last night. He longed for the moment the shutters would close, when the town would fall silent, and the two of them would once again be alone with the sea as their only witness. When evening finally arrived, exhaustion hung heavy in his bones, but rest was impossible. The quiet of the closing hour amplified everything, the scrape of chairs, the rustle of receipts, the distant murmur of waves outside. The scent of roasted beans clung stubbornly to his clothes, mingling with the salt air that drifted in whenever the door opened. Each small sound felt like a reminder of the fragile secret they carried. The attic room no longer felt like a sanctuary. It was a cage of restless thoughts, its walls too narrow to contain the storm inside him. Adrian lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams, tracing the faint cracks in the plaster as though they might hold answers. He thought of Damien only a few steps away, separated by thin walls and silence. The nearness was unbearable. The memory of standing by the window, of that fragile closeness, replayed in his mind with painful clarity. It was not something he could push aside anymore, it had taken root, twisting deeper with every hour. As days turned into weeks, the silence between them became both shield and torment. They did not speak of what had happened. No words were exchanged, no confessions made, but their bodies betrayed them in fleeting gestures. Adrian caught the way Damien lingered longer than necessary when handing over a plate, the way his eyes searched the room before settling on him, the way his shoulders seemed tense with an unspoken burden. These fragments were enough to keep the flame alive, but they also fed the fear gnawing at Adrian's watchful eyes and sharp tongues, remained oblivious, or perhaps mercifully indifferent. Yet Adrian could not shake the thought that every laugh, every casual comment, carried a hidden edge. He imagined whispers beginning in corners, suspicions brewing over cups of coffee. Small towns were merciless with secrets, and theirs was not one that could survive exposure. Despite the fear, he could not help the thrill that pulsed beneath it. Each day became a test of endurance, balancing on the thin line between caution and desire. The cafe transformed into a stage where every movement, every look, played out under the guise of routine. Customers saw nothing more than efficiency, two people working side by side as they always had. But for Adrian, the mundane had become electric, each moment a reminder of how fragile and dangerous their bond had become. The ocean outside mirrored his turmoil. Its waves rolled endlessly, sometimes calm, sometimes violent, but always relentless. At night, the sound drifted through the attic windows, filling the silence with its steady rhythm. Adrian found himself drawn to it, standing by the glass just as he had on that pivotal evening. He watched the horizon where the sea dissolved into sky, searching for clarity, but finding only the vast uncertainty of what lay ahead. He wondered how long the silence could hold. Secrets were like storms, they gathered strength quietly, swelling beneath the surface until they broke with unstoppable force. He feared the damage such a storm could cause, not only to himself but to Damien, to the cafe, to the fragile life they had built together in this small town. Yet even as fear tightened around him, another truth pressed in harder: the thought of returning to the emptiness of before was unbearable. The flame, once lit, could not be extinguished without leaving ashes behind. The nights grew longer, the hours heavier. Sleep came fitfully, broken by restless shifts and the weight of unspoken words. In the dim light of early morning, Adrian often caught his reflection in the mirror, eyes shadowed, expression taut, as if carrying a burden too heavy to name. He wondered if Damien looked the same, if he too lay awake with thoughts that refused to quiet. There was a strange comfort in the silence, a fragile understanding that did not need words. But silence was also treacherous. It left too much room for doubt, too much space for fear to take root. And so, each day began again with the same rhythm, the same pretense of normalcy, the same dangerous fire burning beneath the surface. By the end of the second week, Adrian realized the truth he had been avoiding. What had begun as a fleeting moment by the window had become something far greater, something that could no longer be dismissed as chance or weakness. It was a force, silent but consuming, shaping the way he moved, the way he breathed, the way he looked at the world. It was a secret too heavy for one person to carry alone. And yet, for now, he carried it. Alone, in silence, with the relentless ocean as his only confidant. The third week brought with it an unease that could no longer be contained. What had once been manageable silence began to feel brittle, like glass stretched too thin under pressure. Adrian felt it in every corner of the cafe, in the air of the attic, in the rhythm of the town itself. The calm surface of their lives was starting to fracture, and he knew that the smallest push could shatter it. The cafe remained the same outwardly, cups lined neatly on the counter, chairs scraped softly against the floor, the scent of coffee drifting lazily into the street. Yet Adrian noticed the changes creeping in around the edges. Customers lingered longer than before, their eyes sharper, their voices pitched with curiosity. He could not tell if it was paranoia or reality, but he caught himself watching them as if they were hunters circling prey. Every laugh in the corner sounded like mockery, every whispered word felt like suspicion. The air carried a charge, subtle but persistent, as if the town itself had begun to sense the shift between the two men who worked silently behind the counter. Damien moved with the same efficiency, his hands steady as he carried trays or polished glassware. Yet there was a tension in his shoulders that betrayed the calm. His silence was no longer simply unspoken understanding, it was heavy, guarded, almost defensive. Adrian recognized it because he felt the same weight himself. The unaddressed fire between them had grown too large to ignore, but neither dared to reach for words that might ignite it fully. At night, the attic felt smaller, the walls pressing inward as if to suffocate. The sound of the ocean, once a comfort, now roared with an intensity that mirrored the storm within him. Adrian found himself pacing the floorboards, restless, unable to sleep. He stood by the window, staring at the dark horizon, wishing the waves could carry away the secret that bound him so tightly. Yet no tide could erase what had already taken root. One evening, after a long day of carefully maintained routine, a storm broke over the town. Rain lashed against the windows of the cafe, wind rattled the shutters, and the sea roared with violent force. The streets emptied quickly, leaving only the sound of water rushing in the gutters. Inside, the cafe felt like a fragile vessel adrift on a raging ocean. Adrian wiped the counter slowly, his hands trembling not from exhaustion but from the intensity of the moment. With every crack of thunder, the air between him and Damien seemed to spark. That night in the attic, the storm continued its assault, and sleep became impossible. Adrian sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the door that separated him from Damien. The thin wood felt like the last barrier between silence and revelation. He imagined walking across the hall, opening it, and letting every unspoken thought spill out. But fear rooted him to the floorboards. The storm outside was safer than the one that might break within these walls. The following days carried the weight of aftermath. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered. Adrian sensed eyes on him wherever he went, not only in the cafe but in the market, along the narrow lanes, even on the cliffs where he sometimes walked alone. The town was small, and small towns fed on rumor. Perhaps nothing had been spoken yet, but suspicion was a current that moved silently, invisible until it pulled you under. He felt the current tugging now. Damien too seemed changed. His silence had grown deeper, not the companionable kind but one tinged with restraint, as if he were locking away every thought behind a wall too thick to break. The distance hurt more than it should have. For Adrian, silence had once been enough, but now it felt like a betrayal, a refusal to acknowledge the fire that consumed them both. The unspoken had become unbearable. One afternoon, while sweeping the floor near closing time, Adrian glanced up to find a customer staring too intently. The gaze lingered, curious, almost probing, before shifting away. It was a small moment, easily dismissed, yet it lodged in his chest like a splinter. He realized then how fragile everything was. A single careless look, a slip of the mask, and their secret would no longer be theirs to keep. The attic, once their refuge, became a place of constant tension. Nights stretched into endless hours of tossing, of restless thoughts circling the same dangerous path. Adrian began to write in a notebook, scrawling fragments of thoughts he could not speak aloud. The pages filled with half-formed confessions, with fears and longings that tangled together into something raw and uncontainable. He hid the notebook beneath the floorboards, ashamed of his weakness, yet unable to destroy the only place where truth could exist. The sea, which had always offered solace, now seemed to taunt him. Its waves crashed against the cliffs with merciless rhythm, as if mocking his hesitation. He stood there often, letting the salt spray sting his skin, daring himself to admit the truth aloud to the horizon. But the words never came. The ocean did not need to hear them, and Damien, it seemed, did not wish to. As the days blurred together, the cracks widened. Adrian noticed it in the way his hands shook when their fingers brushed, in the way his chest tightened when Damien walked past without a glance, in the way silence stretched unbearably between them even when the room was filled with noise. Something had to give. The storm could not be contained forever. Late one night, as the attic lay cloaked in darkness, Adrian realized that the silence had become more dangerous than the truth. Secrets could be hidden for a time, but they had a way of surfacing, tearing through lives with the force of inevitability. He feared the day their secret would no longer belong to them, when it would be exposed under the harsh light of the town's scrutiny. Yet part of him also longed for it, for the unbearable silence to finally break, for the fire to either consume them fully or burn itself out. The glass was cracking. He could hear it in the silence, feel it in the tension, see it in the way Damien's eyes avoided his. One way or another, it would shatter. The only question was when, and what pieces would remain once it did. The days that followed became a relentless test of endurance. The fragile balance that Adrian and Damien had clung to was unraveling thread by thread, each moment threatening to expose what they had fought so desperately to conceal. The town had begun to watch more closely, or perhaps Adrian only imagined it, but the weight of observation pressed against him with every step he took. It was no longer possible to move unseen. The cafe, once their safe haven, now felt like a stage where every gesture could be misread, every glance could betray too much. The scrape of a chair, the clatter of a spoon, the shuffle of feet across the floor, everything seemed louder, sharper, as if the world itself was tuned to a frequency that exposed their unease. Adrian found himself rehearsing his movements, careful to keep them neutral, careful not to linger too long in Damien's presence. Yet even the effort to appear ordinary seemed suspicious. Authenticity was slipping away, replaced by a rigid mask that threatened to crack under pressure. At night, the attic pressed heavier on his chest than ever before. Sleep became a rare commodity, haunted by the sense that the walls themselves were listening. He would lie awake, staring at the beams above, feeling the air grow heavier with every unspoken truth. The sea outside roared like an accusation, waves hammering against the cliffs as though demanding confession. He longed to release the storm inside him, but fear strangled every impulse. Silence was safer, though safety had become its own prison. The fracture widened on a late afternoon when a group of strangers passed through the town. They carried the air of outsiders, curious, observant, eyes sharp with interest rather than familiarity. Their presence unsettled Adrian more than he cared to admit. He felt their stares linger longer than the locals ever did, their questions sharper, their gazes darting between him and Damien as if piecing together an unseen puzzle. The laughter that followed felt pointed, though no words were spoken to confirm it. For the rest of the evening, his hands shook whenever he touched a cup, the weight of suspicion pressing heavier with each passing moment. Rumors, he realized, did not need words to grow. They thrived in the silence, in the spaces between looks, in the gaps left unaddressed. The town was fertile ground for such growth, and Adrian felt vines of speculation creeping closer, threatening to strangle the life they had carefully built. Damien, too, seemed aware of the shift. His movements grew sharper, more deliberate, as though every action was calculated defense. The silence between them had transformed into something brittle, threatening to splinter at the slightest touch. What had once been an unspoken bond now felt like a fragile shield barely holding against the tide. One evening, as the cafe emptied and the street outside grew quiet, Adrian felt the inevitability of collapse pressing in on him. The lanterns flickered, shadows stretching long across the wooden floor, and in that dim light, the truth felt dangerously close to surfacing. He could sense it in the way his chest tightened, in the way his throat burned with words unsaid, in the way Damien's presence pulled at him like a force of nature he could no longer resist. Yet still he held back, fear anchoring him to silence. The attic that night was unbearable. The storm inside him matched the storm outside, where wind clawed at the shutters and rain battered the roof. He stood by the window, watching the ocean thrash in fury, and felt the line between safety and exposure thin to breaking. The waves hurled themselves against the rocks with merciless rhythm, and he wondered how much longer he could withstand the same assault within himself. In the days that followed, the town's suspicion seemed to harden. Glances grew sharper, whispers heavier, though no accusations ever passed the air. Adrian caught sight of neighbors exchanging looks as he walked by, of customers lingering too long after finishing their drinks, of shadows that seemed to follow him when he thought himself alone. Perhaps it was paranoia, but paranoia could be as deadly as truth when fed by silence. The tension built toward a single evening when the cafe was unusually crowded. The air buzzed with conversation, chairs pressed close, the scent of coffee thick in the space. Adrian moved among the tables, his body stiff with vigilance, every step careful. Yet despite his efforts, he felt the weight of eyes on him at every turn. At one point, as he passed near the counter where Damien stood, their shoulders brushed. It was the smallest touch, gone in an instant, yet he felt the room shift. Conversations dipped, glances flicked, silence rippled just long enough to pierce the air before noise resumed. The moment was fleeting, but it was enough to plant dread deep within him. Later, as the last customers trickled out and the cafe emptied, Adrian found himself trembling. The mask had slipped, if only for a second, and that second might have been enough. He thought of the looks exchanged, of the way silence had momentarily deepened, and knew that suspicion had grown teeth. The attic that night was suffocating. He paced the floor, heart pounding with the knowledge that exposure was no longer a distant threat but an approaching certainty. The notebook beneath the floorboards called to him, filled with confessions he dared not speak, but even reading them now felt dangerous. He resisted, instead pressing his palms against the wooden beams as though the structure itself could absorb his turmoil. Outside, the sea was relentless, pounding the cliffs with unyielding force. Adrian watched it from the window, feeling the salt spray sting his face, and recognized the mirror it offered, waves forever crashing, never still, never satisfied. He realized then that the storm could no longer be contained. Whether by choice or by force, the truth would surface. And as dawn approached, painting the sky in pale shades of gray, Adrian understood that the question was no longer if they would be exposed, but when. The silence had carried them this far, but silence itself was breaking apart, fragile as glass beneath a hammer. The edge had been reached, and beyond it lay only the fall. Morning arrived with a deceptive calm. The town stretched awake under a pale sky, the sea unusually still as though it too was holding its breath. Adrian stepped into the cafe that day with the weight of inevitability pressing against his ribs. Every movement felt rehearsed, every glance a test, every sound sharpened into something threatening. The air carried a charge that could not be ignored, a heaviness that spoke of something about to give way. The first hours passed without incident, yet the atmosphere was different. Customers gathered in small groups, their conversations hushed but not secretive, their eyes carrying something sharper than simple curiosity. It was not what they said, but the way they lingered on pauses, the way their attention seemed always half-focused on Adrian and Damien. The familiar hum of daily life had shifted into something tense, an orchestra tuning before the clash of music, strings pulled taut and trembling. Adrian moved through the cafe with the precision of someone walking a tightrope. He smiled when expected, placed cups where they belonged, cleared tables with mechanical efficiency. Inside, however, his chest was a battlefield. He could feel the storm clawing for release, his body heavy with the strain of silence. Every second stretched thin, fragile enough to shatter. He imagined cracks forming in the air around him, invisible fissures widening with each restrained breath. The breaking point came without warning. A sound, small and insignificant, tipped the balance, a tray slipping from his hand, porcelain shattering across the floor. The cafe fell into sudden silence, every gaze converging at once. The sound of the crash lingered, echoing louder than it should have, filling the room with a tension that swelled beyond control. Adrian froze, the fragments of porcelain scattered at his feet a reflection of himself, broken open under the weight of too many eyes. In that silence, the truth pressed forward, uncontainable. It was not spoken aloud, yet it did not need to be. The room had already drawn its conclusion, pieced together from glances, gestures, and the silence that had carried more weight than words ever could. Adrian felt the shift wash over him like a cold tide, the unmasking happening not in a declaration, but in collective recognition, leaving behind an atmosphere stripped of pretense. Whispers followed, not loud enough to be accusations, but steady enough to spread. Adrian continued his tasks in a haze, his body moving without conscious thought, the reality of exposure settling heavy across his shoulders. He felt both lighter and crushed, freed from concealment yet bound by its consequences. That night in the attic, he did not attempt to sleep. He sat by the window, staring out at the vast expanse of sea that stretched endlessly into the dark. The ocean roared not in fury this time, but in rhythm, as though acknowledging what had transpired. For the first time, the silence inside him matched the silence outside, heavy, still, unresisted. He thought of the notebook hidden beneath the floorboards. It had been a secret repository, a vessel for words unspeakable. Now, though, the need for it had diminished. The truth no longer lived solely in hidden ink, it was written across the town, whispered in alleyways, etched into the way neighbors watched with sharper eyes. Secrets could not survive once cracked open. The notebook was no longer a sanctuary, but a relic of what had already passed. The following days blurred together in muted tones. Life continued, as it always does, but nothing was the same. Customers still entered the cafe, though the air carried a new distance, a subtle wariness. Conversations still filled the space, though they skirted around the silence that had been broken. Damien worked with the same discipline as before, but his presence carried a new gravity, as though each action acknowledged the change. Adrian moved through it all with quiet resilience. The storm within him, once violent and suffocating, had transformed into something steady, less frantic but no less heavy. He no longer feared the glances, though they still cut. The dread that had once stalked him at every turn had given way to inevitability, and in inevitability, he found a strange form of endurance. The weight remained, but it was no longer hidden, it was shared, dispersed, existing in the open rather than in the shadows. The town did not collapse around him. The earth did not split open. The sea did not swallow him whole. Life continued, though altered, and Adrian found himself learning to live within that alteration. The silence he once clung to as protection had betrayed him, cracking under its own pressure, yet in its breaking he discovered that survival was still possible. The attic became less of a prison after that. He still retreated there, still listened to the ocean roar against the cliffs, but the walls no longer seemed to close in with the same force. He began to breathe more easily, not because the burden was gone, but because it had shifted. The storm was no longer contained, it had been released into the world, and though it carried consequences, it no longer consumed him alone. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon in shades of crimson and gold, Adrian stood by the window and let the light fall across his face. The sea reflected fire, the waves carrying both destruction and beauty in their endless rhythm. For the first time in what felt like years, he did not shrink from the sight. He let the storm exist outside him, recognizing it as something that would always rage, but not always within. He understood then that silence had been both shield and weapon, a fragile construct that could not last forever. Its breaking had felt catastrophic, but it had not ended him. The world had shifted, yes, but he still stood. The fragments of porcelain had shattered, yet from them came clarity. As night fell and the stars emerged, Adrian accepted the truth he had resisted for so long. Secrets, once revealed, did not erase life, they simply altered its course. And though the path ahead was uncertain, marked by whispers and wary glances, it was still a path forward. The storm had broken. The silence had shattered. And in their wake, Adrian remained, not untouched, but unbroken.